Right, so hello, welcome everyone to the University of San Diego's Humanities Center Spring Lecture Series on AI and the Humanities. I'm Hannah Holtzman, the Keck Postdoctoral Fellow of Critical Technology Studies, and I'd like to just begin today with a land acknowledgement from the University of San Diego, which was founded on the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation, and to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. So thank you all for joining us for this third of 4 talks in our series this spring. For the past year, several USD faculty have been meeting to discuss foundational texts on the origins of machine intelligence, the nature of thinking, and ethical questions raised by AI. So this series is part of our broader technology studies programming in the Humanities Center and our current focus on artificial intelligence and its social and ethical implications, which I think our speaker today will be speaking quite directly to. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Sylvester Johnson, who is Assistant Vice Provost for the Humanities and Executive Director of the Tech for Humanity Initiative at Virginia Tech. He is the founding director of Virginia Tech's Center for Humanities, which supports human-centered research and humanistic approaches to the guidance of technology. Dr. Johnson's research has examined religion, race, and empire in the Atlantic world, religion and sexuality, national security practices, and the impact of intelligent machines and human enhancement on human identity and race governance. In addition to co-facilitating a national working group on religion and US empire, Dr. Johnson led an artificial intelligence project that developed a successful proof of concept machine learning application to ingest and analyze a humanities text. He is the author of The Myth of Ham in 19th Century American Christianity from 2004, a study of race and religious hatred that won the American Academy of Religion's Best First Book Award, and African American Religions 1500 to 2000 from Cambridge University Press in 2015, an award-winning interpretation of 5 centuries of democracy, colonialism, and freedom in the Atlantic world. Dr. Johnson has also co-edited The FBI and Religion, Faith and National Security Before and After 9/11 from the University of California Press in 2017. And he is founding co-editor of the Journal of Africana Religions. He is currently producing a digital scholarly edition of an early English history of global religions and writing a book on human identity in an age of intelligent machines and human-machine symbiosis. Dr. Jamal Calloway here at University of San Diego has said that Dr. Johnson's work makes Black religious history come alive for him as a scholar and for his students. Dr. Johnson keeps an eye on critical theory, economics, and the Black religious world in a way that is not only sophisticated and imaginable, but also that shows history is never that long ago. So we're so grateful that you're able to join us today, Dr. Johnson. Welcome. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you for your talk entitled Fetishes and Cyborgs. What does the racial history of capital tell us about the digital future of humanity?
Thank you very much, Dr. Holtzman. I'm really grateful for the invitation and so excited to be able to join you today to talk about some of the history of claims and ideas about what things can do, materialities within the context of what I'm referring to as the cultural history of the fetish and human machine combining under this term of the cyborg, to ask, what does the racial history of capital tell us about the digital future of humanity and how are these related? And I want to start by just referring to a few developments that have happened recently in technology. So this is Sophia, the first machine to have been granted citizenship by any nation. In 2019, Saudi Arabia made a surprise announcement during their Future of Investment Summit. They had a conference to which they invited several hundred of the world's wealthiest investors in order to examine some of the opportunities for the economic growth happening from digital technologies in Saudi Arabia. The keynote speaker, or one of the keynote speakers, was Sophia, which is a humanoid AI robot who has been engineered with algorithmic software to enable her to have extemporaneous conversations as well as to give scripted speeches. So she gave a talk at this conference, and it was announced after her talk that she was a citizen, that she'd be granted citizenship in Saudi Arabia. Not surprisingly, this generated a lot of controversy. There were biological humans in many nations throughout the world, such as the United States and Saudi Arabia, that does not allow people to become citizens, or it makes it extremely difficult. There are millions of people in Saudi Arabia, for example, who are ineligible for citizenship because they've not been born in Saudi Arabia. But here's a machine that has rights that some biological humans do not have. There were other reasons that people raised awareness and concern around this. Saudi Arabia, of course, was doing this to point attention to some of their efforts to invest in technology aggressively, particularly digital technologies such as AI and robotics, in order to wean themselves off of petroleum reliance to diversify the revenue stream for their economy. And the robot pictured here, manufactured by the Hanson Robotics Corporation, is very emblematic of that. But there was also attention towards some of the linkages between machines and people. It is, of course, by intention that Sophia can do things that are similar to what humans can do in terms of giving facial expressions, generating extemporaneous speech, being able to engage in a way that is intersubjective, to demonstrate what appears to be empathy, for example. But there are other developments in technology, particularly in AI, that are really efforts to try to approach, to model, to emulate things that people do. So one of those is the Duplex skills of Google's AI assistant. So here in the bottom corner of this slide is the CEO of the Alphabet Corporation, of which Google is a subsidiary, Sundar Pichai, who gave the public launch of the Duplex skill. It's actually worth listening to this on YouTube, because this is a concierge service by Google's assistant. If you need, for example, a hair appointment, you can tell the AI to set up an appointment for you, and it will call a hair salon, it will set up the appointment, it'll have a conversation with the person who answers the phone. And if you listen to this conversation, which is actually demonstrated on the launch that Sundar Pichai did, it's actually fairly difficult to tell that a machine is speaking, because this AI is modeled in order to very, very closely simulate the speaking style of human beings. It's actually designed to be imperfect. So there are some gaps in the speech, there are some ums and ahs, there's some pauses that are similar to what humans ought to do when they're speaking. In other words, those inefficiencies are part of the performance of the human-like experience of this machine. Not to mention its ability to actually engage in an unscripted conversation. This ability of machines to be able to do cognitive work, to do what's called thinking, is something that is particularly important for companies such as IBM. So this slide shows a screenshot of a very historic event. In 2019, IBM's Project Debater software, this is an AI project, engaged in the public debate against a human. So on the left side of this slide is John Donovan, who is the host of Intelligence Squared. That was a show in which this debate was held. In the center there in the gray jacket is an award-winning debater, Rishi Natarajan, who was actually very well known for his skills in picking debate topics and on the fly, with just a few minutes of preparation, being able to launch into a competitive debate, and some technicians who were on the right side there. That black speaker, the black box in the background, that's the speaker for Project Debater, which is connected to a cloud-based computing system that has a very powerful deep neural network software architecture that allows it to read massive amounts of information, so hundreds of thousands of articles about any topic, any given topic, to understand those articles. So IBM emphasizes cognitive computing. What they say is that this type of software actually understands concepts and that it produces insights. So the question that they debated was this: should preschool be subsidized? Think about that. Should preschool be subsidized? So that's not a it's not a simplistic kind of question. It's one that requires not only a sophisticated analysis of issues, but also an ability to be able to respond on the fly to arguments. And that's what Project Debater does. Project Debater will listen to what a human is saying in real time, pick out the logical structure of whatever the argument is, and generate its own response to whatever they're saying in real time on the fly, based on an analytically rich, a skillful analysis of whatever that topic is. In this instance, the human won this debate because they changed more people's minds, but the viewers overwhelmingly agree that they learned a lot more from listening to Project Debater. And this is actually worth seeing. So you can watch this debate on IBM's research website, and IBM has actually created a film about Project Debater that you can also see online. Just to give you a sense of some of the things that are happening in technology, the digital capacity, the growth of AI, and what seem to be very much human-like performances that these machines are doing. Now, one of the things that becomes important is the long history of ideas and efforts to explain what intelligence is, what it means to know. That's at the root of what is often referred to as objecthood or materiality, the theory of what things can do. And one of the most important figures in the efforts to try to explain intelligence, to try to understand what the intellect is doing whenever it is cogitating, when it's intellecting, when it's perceiving things, when it's understanding things. One of the most influential persons is Ibn Rushd, who's pictured here, is also known as Averroes, who was a very significant scholar of the 12th century. In the Aristotelian tradition, produced very famous long commentaries, actually the name is long commentary on Aristotle's De Anima, in which he was trying to explain what intelligence is actually doing. And I have here in this title, The Soul That Knows, because Ibn Rushd was one of many people who worked on what was called the science of the soul. That is, they were trying to explain the work that gets done by people, but the work that happens in this space that's not about material things. So one of the famous quotes that is part of his commentary, that's part of his effort to explain intelligence, is on the left of this slide, in which he says, the intellect is neither a body, by which he means a material entity, nor a power in a body, okay? So it's neither a body nor a power in a body. He's saying it's not something that's a physical entity or material entity, and it's not something that's contained by a material entity. So it's not something that the brain can do, for example. It's not a power that's in the brain. Ultimately, the intellect was a power of the soul. And the soul here means something that is not made of material things. That's why it's not matter, and that's what gives it its significance. He was very influential in shaping these ideas and ended up impacting multiple traditions of thought. He was widely celebrated by Western intellectuals, for example, as being the father of secularism, because he was very effective in creating a set of frameworks and arguments to get at truth that agreed with religious authority, but that did not really rely on religious authority per se, and thus that secularism that he was celebrated for. One of the things that becomes important in the types of traditions of understanding what things can do and what material entities can do and what immaterial entities can do can be seen in the cultural history of what's called fetishism. And so fetishism refers to the idea that there are people who of the world who worshiped objects, or who saw in objects the power of living things, even though those objects were not alive. Another terminology related to this is animism. This was a popular terminology, especially among so-called Victorian anthropologists who looked at indigenous races of peoples, non-European races particularly, and tried to explain their religions as being based on the worship of objects, mistakenly thinking that those objects had personhood or the power of things that were alive. So this image that you see here is portraying an encounter between the royal court, the monarch of the Congolese Empire on the left side. So this was during the 1400s. And on the right side, visitors who are merchants coming from Lisbon. So we'll call them Portuguese, even though Portugal proper was something that was officially recognized after the 1400s. So this meeting between the Congolese and the Portuguese established in the 1400s a very important network of trade that started off as an exchange of different kinds of commodities, of materials such as clothing materials or jewelry, particularly gold, and other valuable objects. And it quickly began to include the human trafficking of people who had been abducted and who were forced into what historians would come to call the African slave trade. Something very important happened in those exchanges, in the commercial or business relationships that got set up between these African merchants on the one hand and European merchants on the other. And that is, European merchants were fascinated, if also troubled, by the fact that African merchants would culminate their business deals by either wearing some type of material, or they would maybe drink some type of concoction that they said would watch over them and would determine whether or not they had fulfilled their business contracts. And if they violated the business agreement, the business contract, trying to cheat their business partners, harm would come to them because whatever they drank or whatever they wore would see that they were not abiding by this contract. And if they did what they were supposed to do and they were acting in good faith, then they would not come to any harm, because the objects that they wore or the material that they drank would actually be able to surveil them. According to these European merchants and those who were in their traditions and who wrote about these things, this was evidence that these African merchants were superstitious or were delusional, that they were actually wrongly perceiving what things could and could not do. In fact, what got called fetishism in this context was based on this perception that Africans were actually delusional because they thought that things acted like people and they were not having the proper relationship with these objects. One of the most important works that gets written that is articulating this idea was by Charles de Brosse, a very popular text that he wrote in 1760 entitled The Cult of the Fetish Gods, which had this claim that I have here on the left side. He said that fetishism is the original religion of the Blacks, because it arose, what he argued, from as coming from their inferior racial nature, that they had a childlike fascination with the world and a childlike naivete. Their intellect was not sophisticated enough to understand that material objects could not behave in ways that people could behave. People could know, people could understand, people could surveil, but objects did not have personhood, and people were not merely material things. People contain this spiritual reality, this soul, which allowed them to know. So that conceit, that idea was actually very influential. It functioned in order to justify various practices of racism, particularly the African slave trade. And it's in this context that I actually want to point to some of the linkages between the racial history of commercialism, particularly capitalism, that it develops during the African slave trade, and that it's innovated during the African slave trade, and that is shaped in this context by colonial and racial tactics, strategies, and institutions that are partly investing in these kinds of claims to justify what's going on. These Africans are racially inferior. You can see from their childish, delusional religions and behavior that they do not have the kinds of intelligent capacities that the white race has. Those developments on the one hand, and some of what I showed you at the beginning of this slide, the developments in AI, for example, in which machines are doing things that seem to be like what people do. They seem to be able to engage in conversation, to understand concepts, to be able to be intersubjective. On the other hand, these are things that appear to intimate personhood, but then seem to be encroaching upon some very particular concepts of this boundary between people and things. So one of the ways that we can begin to think about this racial history of capital is to appreciate how some of the developments in capitalism were innovated, particularly to make the African slave trade both more efficient and more profitable. So one way that we can begin to move into an inquiry of this past is to think about practices of spiritualizing money on the one hand that are happening in tandem with objectifying people or commoditizing people on the other. The African slave trade was a system of human trafficking, in other words, in which people were treated as objects that could be owned, that could be traded, that could be exchanged. There was some fungibility to them in that sense, while at the same time, money, which is largely being treated as objects. Think of gold bullion, for example, or silver bullion, becoming spiritualized so that it's no longer material. It actually becomes something that is immaterial, that is able then to be translated and put into effect in very complex ways. Here are examples of those complex ways. So the modern systems of credit were developed in order to make the slave trade more efficient and more profitable. Life insurance was created in order to enable the African slave trade to be more profitable for European merchants and those connected to them. The first people to be insured with life insurance were Africans who were enslaved. Now, these Africans did not benefit from the life insurance, but the white slave traders who owned them or who were particularly involved in the shipping and the transport and the abduction and the transport of these people, they benefited by having the Africans insured so that if or when they died, because there was always a percentage of people who would die in transport, for example, that those who were investing their capital in the slave trade would not lose their money, that they could be reimbursed for the cost of the people who had died. That's the origin of life insurance. And promissory notes. So promissory notes, if you think of a dollar bill, a $5 bill, a $20 bill, a $100 bill, that's a promissory note. What it says is that the person who carries it is owed whatever the amount is on that note, and that a bank then has an obligation to fulfill that debt that the bearer of that note is carrying. Now, when we have cash today, we don't actually take it to a bank and say, well, I'd like to have the whatever stands behind this. It used to be gold. Well, we're not on the gold standard anymore. But today we just have the note. But the point is that during the African slave trade, typically when it starts, if a merchant wanted to purchase people who had been abducted, who'd been kidnapped, and who had been forced into slave trading, they needed physical money in the form of gold or silver bullion. And this was very difficult to carry around. If you've ever picked up a gold brick, it's pretty heavy. It's very dense material. And silver, not quite as dense as gold, but still the same problem. It was very impractical to transport massive amounts of gold or silver or any other form of currency over a long distance. And thus, what we think of as paper money today, the promissory note, was created. It made it possible for someone who was purchasing people who had been kidnapped not to have to wait a long time for their bullion or gold to arrive. They could simply park that money with the bank, and the bank would issue a note promising to pay whoever carried that note, whatever the amount was on the note. And so that paper, that piece of paper was much lighter. It was much easier to transport that paper than it was to pack a ship and float it across the ocean filled with gold or silver bullion. It costs less money to produce it. And this made it faster, much more facile to conduct the slave trade. In other words, money gets spiritualized. It actually becomes something that can be captured in the bundling and collateralization, as we'd say today, or a commodification of anything. So money becomes a very flexible and dynamic spiritualized concept. And I'm using spiritualized here to mean it's no longer being treated as physical material. It's something that becomes much more conceptual and much easier to put into effect and manipulate. At the same time that people are being objectified, made into objects. In other words, part of the racial history of capital is captured and constituted through the simultaneity of taking humans and treating them as objects on the one hand, and taking money as a material object and transforming it into a type of spiritual entity that becomes much easier to manipulate. And these foundational innovations in the history of capitalism make it possible to have a more efficient and profitable form of slavery. Those instruments that I showed you earlier, the promissory note and credit and life insurance, those things would outlive the African slave trade, of course, and they would become very useful to all kinds of people. But they were developed in order to effect greater efficiency and prosperity in this trade. So I want to think about that history of racial capital because there is this concern with what obtains with the spiritualization of money. Again, remember, it's more efficient, it is actually easier, it's profitable, and creates many different avenues for profit to be made through these different institutions of banking and finance and credit, et cetera, and the transport, the shipping of people, and on the other hand, objectifying humans. And these things are happening, of course, against the backdrop or within the context of what I've called the cultural history of the fetish. So Africans are being portrayed, as are other indigenous peoples, as delusional because they supposedly have the wrong ideas about what things can do. Of course, they think they have the right ideas about what things can do, and they're not depending upon some strict binary that would separate so-called humans from things that are not so-called humans. And on the other hand, what's happening with capital. So what is the relationship between that racial history of capital and this digital future of the human? One is that we still have this contest over questions of so-called materiality, what things can do. Today, for example, machines are engineered to be cognitive. I started off with some examples of those. This is an image of the servers for IBM's Watson computing service. This was the first computing service that the IBM Corporation referred to as cognitive computing. So they've avoided calling their machines artificial intelligence because IBM emphasizes that there is actual intelligence, there's actual understanding, there is actual cognitive work that's being performed by these machines. On the right side here is one of the chips in a so-called True North system that IBM has developed to provide very sophisticated algorithmic services. And so IBM would say that thinking and reasoning are not actually exclusive to humans. That's why they developed that human project, that AI project debater software, to be able to actually be on par with a human's ability to understand concepts and debate. And just to give you an example of what this means, and let's take this question of whether a machine can actually create art. So I'm going to show you a couple of images, one created by a machine, another created by a human. I'm not going to say which is which. And I want you to see if you can understand which was created by a human, which was created by a machine. So here's the first, all right? And here's the second image. And you can look at both of these and try to figure out which of these would have been created by a machine and which by a human. So here's the first one again. And here's the second one. And I'll just tell you, so that first image that we saw was created by a human artist. This was created by an AI system developed by Google that sort of reverses the process of image recognition. It was fed, or it ingested, as the terminology is, tens of thousands of images of art. And then it was asked to create an image that it had never seen before. So it had to come up with something new. And this is what it created. Well, if we have to ask which of these was created by a human, is it at least not arguable that, say, someone teaching the history of art at some point would need to include works of art created by machines? In other words, is it not at least debatable that machines can actually create art, that they can do art, which is typically thought of something that is humanistic. Another example, so years ago in 2016, about 5 years ago, a company named DeepMind, which eventually sold the software to, which was eventually acquired by Google. A company called DeepMind developed a software system. They called it Alphago. And it was trained by playing games over and over and over again to become very skilled in the game of Go. And Go is an extremely complex game. It is a game that involves two players alternately placing either their black or white pieces on the board, and one color has to surround and sort of dominate the other color. The way this works is very complicated. It takes experts years to develop these strategies, but it only took AlphaGo a matter of hours to go from not knowing this game to being able to become so skilled that it actually defeated Lee Sedol, who's pictured here, who's a world champion of Go. In response to this, Fei Wang, who is an AI scholar, co-authored an article that was entitled the Alphago Thesis. And that thesis, that basic argument is quoted to the left side, that a decision problem for intelligence is tractable by a human being, so it can be done by a human being, with limited resources, if and only if it is tractable by an AlphaGo-like program. So that's a very technical way of saying that that machines are actually doing intelligence, that the AlphaGo software is actually doing something that's intelligence. Okay, it's phrased in a very technical way, but that's the thesis, that this machine is actually thinking. Even Garry Kasparov, who's a world-renowned chess champion, said of DeepMind software that was similar to AlphaGo that had been developed to play chess, produced chess moves that Garry Kasparov had never seen before. And his response is that in watching this software play chess, he said, we are actually introduced to what he called the truth of chess, because the software is actually understanding things. All right, so I'm just giving you some examples of claims, of putative claims, of possible claims that things can do things. So contrary to what Ibn Rushd would have said, that material things cannot know and are not doing thinking, what we seem to have is evidence that things can think, that intelligence is something that material entities, such as AI software, can actually perform. The performance of this activity and the development of AI is not all about fun and games, of course. We saw in July of 2016, for example, the killing of Micah Johnson, who is pictured here on the left. He was killed by the Dallas Police Department using this machine that's pictured on the right. This is a remotic robot developed by the Northrop Grumman Corporation for use in warfare in Afghanistan. This robot was in the possession of the Dallas Police Department. As people found out around the time that this happened, police departments throughout the country were actually being supplied with similar kinds of military equipment. And I can say more in the Q&A about why that was the case, but the police department attached a pound of C4 to the robot because Micah Johnson was a suspect in the shooting deaths of several police officers. He was inside of a building. He would not come out of the building. So the Dallas Police Department, instead of spending hours and hours in a negotiation situation trying to get him out, they sent in the robot with a pound of C4. They directed the robot to move close to Micah Johnson, and they detonated the C4. The shock wave immediately killed Micah Johnson. So he never had a trial. He never had his day in court. He was the first US citizen to be killed on US soil by a robot. I say on US soil because Anwar al-Awlaki was killed by a drone years earlier, but that was outside of US borders. This was within US borders. And given the racial disparities that we've seen in policing practices and the extensive killing of Blacks who are in police custody or who are being pursued by the police, it's striking to witness and disturbing to witness this kind of pattern. Now, you might say, well, the robot didn't actually kill Michael Johnson. It was a police officer who pressed the trigger to detonate that C4, but that doesn't mean AIs aren't capable of seeking out and killing people on their own. Here's an example of one. For example, this is the JAG-M, Joint Air-to-Ground Missile, developed by the Lockheed Martin Corporation, that's capable of deploying what's called fire and forget technology, meaning that a pilot who is in a fighter plane, they can lock this missile onto a target and they can fire the missile and they can forget all about it. They can head back to safety. The missile will take care of the mission itself. From there, it will seek out the target. It can pursue a target if that target is trying to move. And it even figures out on its own the best angle at which to strike a target in order to get optimal kill or property destruction. This is very much high-powered AI that is being weaponized. In fact, the efforts to weaponize AI, to incorporate AI into military weapons is the most important reason why the world is seeing incredible advances in AI. It's not the only reason. There are lots of efforts to advance AI, but the most high stakes and the most highly funded efforts involve militarization. And this is the United States, this is Israel, this is China, this is Iran, this is Germany. I mean, these are nations around the world that are involved in a type of arms race on steroids. And the effort is to make sure that none of them comes in anything except first. No one wants to be second, third, or fourth, or fifth. We can say more about that in the Q&A, but these developments are incredibly significant, and they underscore some of the concerns about things like AI ethics, for example, which autonomous cars, such as this one that Google is developing, will have to use at some point. They will have to, the cars will need to be able to figure out if there is about to be an accident, an impending impact, how to minimize injury or even death, and at times whether to try to preserve the lives of people in the car, for example, to the detriment of people who might get hit by the car or vice versa, depending on an ethical analysis of that situation. Because so much decision-making is invested in these machines, in fact, Google actually asked the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to recognize the car as the driver of record. In other words, to recognize that the car, not a human, is the driver. And there's some practical reasons for that. Google's cars, the Waymo is technically the subsidiary that's developing this car. There's no steering wheel or turn signals, there are no brake pedals for a driver. The car is designed to be fully, completely autonomous. And the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration actually agreed that they would be willing to recognize the car as a driver. So can an object, can a thing have agency? Can we say that a machine is actually making decisions? Well, at least in this instance, we have the federal government going on record saying that they're willing to acknowledge this. I want to end then with this digital future of humanity. What does this all mean for some of the digital future of humanity? And I want to point to the work of Achille Mbembe particularly as one of many different scholars who has tried to understand some of the implications of the past of technology and race and some of the future of AI and digital innovation for what it means about humanity. This slide that you're looking at shows, it's based on images from Neural.com, and Neural.com is a company that Elon Musk has founded. He's CEO. This company is focused on connecting the human brain to a computing infrastructure using what's called brain computer interface technology, or BCI brain-computer interface technology. So BCI technology is very significant. It was been most aggressively pursued by military industrial states that are seeking to provide some medical therapy for injured soldiers, and also to provide enhancements for soldiers who are not injured, in order to increase their ability to be successful soldiers, to give them superhuman capacities. Elon Musk's company has a more modest goal. They're not creating super soldiers. They're trying to get people to be able to use computers by using their brains. And this involves implanting a brain chip that has a neural connection to a human's brain tissue. So this does require brain surgery. It's probably not going to be a long line for this product when it first launches, but who knows? But it is being designed, it is being developed, and it works as you see here. A small implant into the brain, so that as a person thinks, whatever the brain signal is from their cognition gets replicated by this implant, and that implant then can send a wireless signal that's based on the brain signaling to connect to some computing device. It could be to type, to browse the web, to control a thermostat, to do different things. Now, if that sounds far-fetched, I should tell you that BCI architectures, BCI technologies have been developed for many years and have already been applied. So we see here one example. On the right side is Claudia Mitchell. She was the first woman to receive a brain-controlled prosthetic limb in the early 2000s. So this is called a smart prosthetic device. She controls that left arm simply by thinking about what she wants to do. So there she's thinking of high-fiving someone, and her brain signaling gets transmitted to that prosthetic limb. And it moves in the way that an organic limb would move, so that she can high-five someone. She's high-fiving Jesse Sullivan. He's on the left. He's the first man to have received a brain-controlled prosthetic limb, or so-called smart prostheses. Again, this is from the early 2000s. So that technology allows Claudia Mitchell to feel whatever is happening in that arm. She can detect pressure, for example, and she can feel pain if that hand is being crushed or something is leaning on it too heavily. It hurts. She can actually feel that. I'll end with this slide. This is Ian Burkhart, who in 2014 was injured in a diving accident. He severed his spinal cord and was unable to move his body from the neck down. So here he is, a few years following that, playing a guitar. And you may say, well, hold on, you said he was paralyzed from the neck down. How is he playing that guitar? Well, he has a brain chip implanted, and that brain chip reads his brain signaling. So he's thinking about moving his fingers. That chip in his brain replicates the brain signaling. It wirelessly sends those brain signals to wireless receptors that are on a sleeve or wrapped around his arm. You can't see that sleeve in this picture, but those receptors relay the signal from the chip to his motor neurons in his arm, and then to his fingers, and he's able to play a guitar. In other words, we know that human neurons will talk to machine neurons. They can communicate back and forth. That's why Claudia Mitchell can move her arm and she can feel sensation based on what that prosthetic limb is touching, squeezing, or is up against. And in Ian Burkhart's case, this BCI technology allows him to be able to have restored capacity. So we can think about this history of the cultural claims about the fetish. Can things do things? Can only people think? What are objects capable of? Are people delusional, or have they been delusional in seeing capacities in objects that are typically associated with capacities in people, such as knowing things or feeling things or being able to observe and surveil the world? Or is this actually a legitimate kind of epistemology that has now been iterated in a different guise, so to speak, but in a very compelling and ubiquitous way through digital technologies? And what about that separation between people and things? Can we engineer prosthetic limbs or brain chips to sense, to feel, to relay pressure, pain, or pleasure to people, to their brains, and also claim that those machines cannot feel if in fact they've been engineered for sensation? Will we rely on certain binaries that would distinguish sensing from knowing, for example? Or will we find from the ongoing brain research that is slowly uncovering some of the mechanisms of cognition that those kinds of distinctions have more basis in cultural traditions than they do in scientific fact? These are some of the questions that we are going to have to address as this technology advances. Among the most important things that we will have to address ethically are the lessons that we should be learning from the history of race and capital and objecthood or technology. And I will give you one example of the implication of that. I've shown you two examples of people who are part machine. Ian Burkhart here, Claudia Mitchell in the previous slide, and Jesse Sullivan in that same slide, whose motor capacities have been enhanced through machines. Does their being part machine in any way alter their humanity, or are they 100% human? Okay, so if we think about this past of race and capital and technology, part of that past of the human is clearly based on dehumanizing practices. And one of the implications from that past is that the ethical governance of technology and the ethical future in the digital future of humanity should not be replicating those structures of racism and dehumanization that are part of the history of capital and objecthood and technology, but rather should be a different type of trajectory, a future trajectory that is not rooted in those institutions and epistemologies of racism, but are actually rooted in a different kind of orientation to this question of the human. So I'll pause there. I welcome your comments as well as your questions. And I want to thank you again for the invitation and for the time to speak with you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating talk and so rich. I'm sure we have a lot of questions from participants. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I could just ask you to talk a little bit more. You had talked about the militarization and police use of some of these artificial intelligence technologies, and obviously the example, with the robot killing a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil is certainly a startling example, but I'm sure there are many more. So if you wanted to just say a bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the policing technologies are heavily militarized, and they are by design. So in the 1960s, the FBI introduced militarization to police departments, and it started as a way to try to destroy Black liberation movements. This is part of something called counterintelligence programs, or COINTELPRO. It was iterated, or began through the creation of special weapons and tactics, or SWAT. So the first police department in the US to have SWAT was the Los Angeles Police Department. It was not the last. Today, SWAT is a standard way of police operating. It was based on military weapons, military tactics. So again, the origins was to destroy Black freedom movements because these were being identified wrongly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation as a threat to national security. And the result over decades is that militarized policing has just become policing. Now, it is still the case that there are tremendous racial disparities in the outcomes of the policing. So the way that Black and Latinx communities and indigenous communities are affected by this are far more deadly than typically for whites, although all peoples have at some point demographically have been victims of unjust policing practices, but it's very disproportionate. So the origin was rooted in very racist responses to efforts to be transformative of society and have more democratic practices in society. The weapons that are used involve the robots that you saw. So when the Dallas Police Department announced what they had done, police departments throughout the country chimed in and said, yes, they did the right thing. We would have done the right thing. We have the same kind of equipment. It's very widespread. Of course, the use of AI for facial recognition is far more pervasive even. Facial recognition is not a weapon per se, but it does become a way of structuring very harmful practices because of the hyper-surveillance of communities of color, the loss of privacy, the lack of any true regulatory framework around these technologies is also a problem.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, we just had a discussion last week about the film Coded Bias that gets at some of those issues very well.
Thank you. Wanting to use technology, in this case, artificial intelligence, to reduce discrimination, racial discrimination, maybe even homophobia, misogyny, or not make it worse through the technology. Those are all necessary causes, and we want to stop discrimination. But what type of discussions, what type of questions should we actually be asking before we actually put all the pressure on the scientists working on the infrastructure and the physical technology? But which type of question should we be asking ourselves? In my case, a historian, but somebody working in biology, sociology, even physics. I mean, obviously it falls into ethics, but before we can ask ourselves, you know, we say we should stop it. I mean, what type of discussion should we be having? I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself. I'll stop.
Yeah, that's great. A very important question. So there are multiple strategies that are important to pursue. One question that should be asked is, what is the historical and political and social and economic context of whatever is happening? Because one thing that's clear is that policing in the United States is the most carceral nation on the planet. So we incarcerate at a higher rate than any other country in the world. And we incarcerate more people than any other country. And that's impressive if we compare the United States to China, for example. They have over 1 billion people, but we still incarcerate more people. That has not actually stopped crime. It has not reduced crime. And so another question we should ask is, what's our goal? If our goal is actually to make society safer and to reduce crime, then we need to do something else, because this actually doesn't work. It doesn't stop crime. It doesn't reduce it. That's a couple of examples. And then what are the things that need to happen? Of course, we need lots of different kinds of talent in the leadership of technology. So I like to point out that one thing we should learn is that technology is not just technical. It's not just STEM. It is lots of things. And we need people who are skilled in understanding inequality. We need people who are skilled in understanding creativity, in regulatory frameworks, in business practices, all of those things to help us govern technology. That's everything from design to implementation and regulation. So those are just some of the things that need to happen. Thanks for your question.
Okay, so I'll just read the question from the chat. At the light of the trajectory of the material personhood you traced, how do you see the initial understanding of fetishism? Was it a hypocritical view or the misunderstanding that influenced the personhood of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's some of both. I mean, it would be naive to think that the European authors who were trying to represent Blacks and indigenous peoples throughout the world were unconcerned with power, wealth, the slave trade, or anything like that. They were operating in an imperial context. But it would also be reductive to say, well, they were only trying to justify slavery and nothing else was going on. They're also interested in explaining things. And some things they did perceive, I have argued correctly. I think they did recognize a distinctive framework, a philosophy of agency and objects and things that was not entirely unlike what was happening in Europe. So we can look at Christian practices and Jewish practices with objects and see some similar kind of postures, but there are also distinctive things that are going on. It was treating objects as having agency was legitimate, for example, in these West Central African societies in the Congo Kingdom. So it's some of both. They were trying to interpret things. Some of it was misunderstanding, misperception. Some things they got right. I think they were right to say there is a different kind of epistemology here. That was true. They were wrong to say, these people are inferior and they're childlike. That was wrong. And were they influenced by these other material interests and political contexts? Absolutely, that was part of their world. And that did in fact shape how they leverage these arguments or made these claims. Thanks for the question.
One thing that I was thinking about, and this came up in the chat as well, but just sort of how AI in general is asking us to sort of, Jaime asks, first, shouldn't we ask ourselves, what is art? So asking us to rethink the definitions of some of these things like art, like intelligence. And you used the term, particularly, you said that these machines are performing intelligence, or in a way that we might, maybe we could see the AI, Google's AI art venture as sort of performing art. And I wonder if that's a distinction that you're making, or if that's something that I'm sort of reading into what you were saying.
No, you're very perceptive. That is correct. I'm trying to, I think that there's a good argument to be made that machines are thinking. You know, they're certainly making decisions. So if you ever use GPS to get somewhere, that GPS is designed at the software level through decision trees. And it has to give you some results, which most people will follow. And so one could say, yeah, it's making decisions, not actually thinking. So I'm being a little careful there, because I'm trying to recognize that these are debatable issues, that it's debatable whether this machine is actually thinking. And that's part of what I'm trying to do, is also show there's a long history of debate about what things can do and people can do. And that has consequences for humanization and dehumanization. But I was trying to allow for that with that language. So you're being very perceptive.
Thank you very much for your talk. So maybe, I hope this is not too far away from the topic, but especially when we were talking about agency, what strike a little bit with me was again the failings of the humanist thinking, and the notions that humanists would pick and choose what is a person or what is an agent, and of course that took away from a lot of actual people and actual humans. And I was wondering if, in your opinion, the post-humanist turn would be something of a solution to think more about networks and ecologies and being mindful of us as a system and not as entities?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think in a nutshell, yes. I know we're about out of time. So yes, I do think that's very helpful to recognize the contributions and insights coming from post-humanism. People have also been very critical of post-humanism because of it tends to be racially exclusive, and a lot of the people who are participating in dialogue, that kind of thing, as do other things. That's not unique to post-humanism. But yes, I think they're important insights. I think that we need multiple strategies to get to fair, equitable, inclusive outcomes. And I think anytime we are including more people, especially people who have the most to lose from when things go wrong, if we do more inclusion in that way, in whatever it is that we're doing, we're gonna have better outcomes. So I think if we put that with post-humanism, let's be more inclusive. Let's try to figure out who has the most to lose from this stuff, and make sure that we are doing everything we can to be more inclusive in their level of being stakeholders, and take those insights. Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.